Back when my husband Greg and I were in our 20s, we had the strangest experience we'd ever had. It was right before we had kids, which was a year later, but I remember the day like it was yesterday. We were riding in Greg's dad's 1959 GMC Blue Chip series at the time. He had let us borrow it for our road trip. We'd been out of high school for a while, and were now in college. We were on vacation at the time, and this, of course, was around the time when Route 66 was active. So I guess me mentioning that I'm showing my age. We were headed to California for a friend's wedding at the time. Greg's dad had recently restored the 1959 GMC Blue Chip series that we were driving, and it was a beauty. My husband had the vehicle all the way up to his death in 2004. When he died, I sold the vehicle to some nice barista girl and her girlfriend down the road. Greg and I were just enjoying the route, seeing all of what America had to offer. Greg and I had not really ever been on a road trip before, and though we had been on a lot of road trips after, though. There were things about the road trip that still haunt me to this day. The day had started out like any other day, to be honest. Nothing was off about it. Greg's dad had installed a radio into the car that was brand new. It was the only thing in the car that was brand new. Everything else about the 1959 GMC Blue Chip series was original and just renewed in all its glory. So there, Greg and I were just driving down Route 66, listening to the radio. I actually remember the radio station as well. The song The Power of Love was playing on the radio. I had my head out the window, enjoying the fresh country air. At the point, we had ran into a small town and got ourselves some gas and snacks, but of course that wouldn't be enough. It's how we stumbled upon the place. It had gotten dark out and we were having trouble staying awake. We weren't sure how long we had traveled, to be honest, but it had gotten dark is what we did know. There seemed to be no small towns in sight, and we weren't sure how long it had been since we left the previous town. I assumed it had been a few hours at least, since the last place we had stopped at had still been daylight. "Greg, I'm getting hungry," I admitted, and Greg looked over at me. "Yeah, babe, I hear you. Soon I'm sure there's bound to be something." I nodded, and that's when I saw the sign. It seemed worn down enough, but it couldn't hurt to try the place. The sign said Mcdougle's Diner, coming up on the right. I said, "Did you see that sign?" And Greg nodded. He said, "It's probably a small town diner, and I doubt that it's open this late, though." And I sighed. "You're probably right." After all, growing up in a small town ourselves, I was sure he was right. Places in small towns always closed around the time the sun set, and it was way past that time. The radio had quit playing music, and I had noticed, but then out of the blue, a commercial came on. If neither of us had been awake, we sure were now. The radio announcer said, "Are you hungry? Want a quick bite? Then come to the best small-town eatery on this side of the Mississippi River, Mcdoogle's. Once you're here, you'll never want to leave." And then the commercial was over. At the time, we should have noticed, but we didn't. The radio went silent, but both Greg and I were hungry, and we ignored the obvious warning sign. Greg and I agreed that if we saw the place, we'd stop if they looked like they were open. I watched my side of the road as Greg continued driving, and it seemed like there was nothing in sight for maybe 1,000 miles. Now the thing is you don't understand, is Route 66, when it was open back then, that's not how the road worked. The reason Route 66 was so infamous back when it was a thing is because all the amazing things you could find on the route. So there was no possible way that we could be on Route 66 and not stumble upon anything. Back in those days, there was no way to check to make sure you were on the right path other than a paper map. We didn't have Google Maps or GPS. Greg and I, though, were sure that we were still on Route 66. We had not taken any other roads that led off of Route 66 or anything of that nature. I swear, though, now looking back as we get closer to where our lives would change forever, we had taken a road to another, I don't know. I guess some would call it another plane of existence, but my generation would call it the Twilight Zone. As Greg drove down the desolate highway, the landscape seemed to blur into a mountainous expanse of shadowy trees and overgrown weeds. The sky, a canvas of dark, brooding clouds, hinted at an impending storm. Just as the tension in the air became almost palpable, the headlights caught a flicker of light in the distance. The car approaches cautiously, the glow revealing itself to be a dilapidated diner, haphazardly perched on the edge of the road. Its neon sign, once a beacon for weary travelers, now sputtered weakly, casting an unsettling red hue over the cracked parking lot. The letters spelled out, Mcdougle's Diner, though several were missing, making it more look like Mcdougle's didn't. The building itself seemed frozen in time, a relic from a bygone era. Its paint was peeling, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of grime, distorting any view of the interior. A rusted metal awning creaked ominously in the wind, and an old gas pump stood sentinel near the entrance, its numbers long faded. The place, though, had its lights on from Mcdougle's Diner, so we assumed it was open. The car rolled slowly into the parking lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel and broken glass. The headlights cut through the thick veil of darkness, revealing a sprawling expanse of neglect and decay. Weeds, rebellious and overgrown, snaked through the cracks in the asphalt, giving the ground an almost sinister texture. Scattered haphazardly across the lot were a few abandoned vehicles, their rusted carcasses standing as silent witnesses to the passage of time. The once vibrant colors of their paint jobs had faded to dull, lifeless shades, and their windows were either shattered or coated with a film of grime. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the tires of the car as if they were reluctant to let them pass. The flickering neon sign cast an eerie red glow over the scene, its intermittent buzzing adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Puddles of stagnant water reflected the dim light, their surfaces rippling with every gust of the chilling wind. Greg and I noticed that some of the puddles had an oily sheen, rainbow colors dancing on the murky water, hinting at something toxic. Old rusted light poles leaned at awkward angles, their bulbs long since burnt out. The shadows they cast seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, creating a maze of darkness. As Greg parked the car's engine echoed in the unnerving silence, a stark contrast to the oppressive stillness that enveloped the area. Stepping out of the car, Greg and I felt the crunch of debris beneath our feet, and the cold, damp air pressing in around us. The parking lot, with its eerie ambience and palpable sense of abandonment, seemed to whisper warnings, urging them to turn back while they still could. As we stepped out of the car, a chill ran down my spine. Later, as Greg and I would put the pieces of what happened that night together, Greg would tell me that he too felt a chill run down his spine. Everything in our bodies told us to leave, but our stomachs seemed to overrule our fear. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, almost like blood. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional rustle of leaves. Despite the eerie silence, Greg and I felt an inexplicable pull towards the diner, as if it held secrets that demanded to be uncovered. With the mix of trepidation and curiosity, Greg and I stepped away from our car and began walking towards the diner's entrance. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the desolate parking lot, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot mingling with the distant rustle of leaves. The path to the door was lined with cracked concrete fragments jutting out like jagged teeth. The air grew colder, and a faint smell of mildew and something rotten lingered. As we drew close, the flickering neon sign above cast an eerie, pulsating light, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The exterior walls of the diner were once painted a cheerful shade of red, now dulled and peeling away in large flakes, revealing patches of rust and bare metal. Beneath, vines crept up the sides of the building, their tendrils wrapping around broken fixtures and snaking through shattered windows. A lone rusty bell hung above the door, its clapper missing, as if it hadn't been rung in years. Greg and my eyes were drawn to the entrance, a heavy weathered door with a small, grimy window set into its upper half. The glass was so coated in filth that it was impossible to see inside. An old open sign, its letters faded and chipped, dangled crookedly in the window, swaying slightly in the breeze. We hesitated briefly at the threshold, noticing the tarnished handle and the thick layers of grime caked around it. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and a few dead leaves rustled across the ground, swept by an unseen force. The door itself groaned in protest as we pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the still night air. Beyond the door lay darkness, the interior illuminated only by the weak, intermittent glow of the neon sign outside. Greg and I both exchanged a glance, a mixture of unease and determination in our eyes, before stepping inside, the door creaking shut behind us, sealing us within the diner's mysterious, eerie embrace. An elderly gentleman with an old-fashioned apron and blue jeans walked up to us, greeting us. "Welcome to Mcdougle's, where once you are here, you'll never want to leave." He said this with somewhat of an old southern accent. There was an elderly woman that looked about 95 or something that stood behind the register. The way the skin on her was very tight around her body that seemed like a skeleton with only skin and no muscle. She smiled at us, but the smile was unnerving, that woke some primal fear within me that I didn't know how to react. Another person walked up with a menu in their hands, but something was off about his lips. I would later recall that what was off about his lips, that someone had stitched his lips shut so he could not speak, though at the time I hadn't noticed that was what was wrong. The elderly gentleman said, "Don't worry about Edgar, he's the silent type." "Thank you, Edgar," he said as he grabbed the menus as he handed them to us. The elderly gentleman introduced himself. "I'm Leonard, and the woman behind the register is my wife Lenora. And here is our fine establishment where we have the best food on this side of the Mississippi River." And he walked us over to the table. We sat down at the table and began to look at the menus. The place had your usual appetizers like cheese sticks, french fries, fried pickles, cheesy bread, fried okra, and stuff like that. Greg and I both looked at the drink menu, and it had your usual sweet tea and coffee, of course. Also on the menu were Pepsi products. Greg ordered sweet tea while I ordered a Pepsi. We told Leonard that we needed some time to look at the menu to see what we wanted to order. He smiled and walked away while we looked at the menu. I looked around and noticed there was no one else at the restaurant other than Greg, me, Leonard, Lenora, and Edgar. I wondered, where were all the other people? I knew it was late at night, but you still would think there would be a few other people other than us. The place seemed quiet, and I noticed the lights were giving the place a strange, eerie look, and the lights were red. I thought the choosing of red lights for a diner was an odd choice. Why would a diner have such an eerie choice for lights? Leonard came back with our drinks and smiled as he handed the drinks to us. Greg took a sip of his tea, and I took a sip of my Pepsi. I felt a little light-headed for some reason, but I ignored it, thinking it was because I hadn't eaten for several hours. Greg told Leonard that we were ready to order the appetizers. We ordered cheese sticks and fried pickles. Leonard smiled and said he'd have Edgar bring out the cheese sticks and fried pickles when they were ready. Greg ordered a cheeseburger and french fries, while I ordered a patty melt with onion rings. Leonard nodded and said they'd get right on that. He again walked away just as Greg and I just sat there enjoying our drinks. Greg looked over at Lenora, who was still behind the register. He looked back at me with some fearful look on his face. I asked, "Is something wrong?" And Greg said, "Maybe I'm just tired, but I swear, when I looked over at Lenora, her head moved in an unnatural way." I laughed. "Greg, she's just an old lady. I'm sure you're just seeing things." And he shrugged his shoulders. In a few moments, as we sat there in silence, Edgar finally came with the cheese sticks and fried pickles. Greg and I started eating the cheese sticks and fried pickles. As I ate the food, I felt the need to get up to use the restroom. That's when I noticed I couldn't move my legs. "Greg, I can't seem to move." And Greg tried to move as well, but he said, "I can't move either." Perhaps Greg was right earlier when he swore Lenora's head moved in a unnatural way. We both tried to struggle to get up, but we couldn't move, and that's when I saw Leonard laughing as he walked over with Lenora. Both of their smiles sent shivers down my spine. It was that feeling you get when people say that someone in the future just walked over your grave. Like I said when you walked in here, once you are here, you'll never want to leave. Leonard laughed maniacally as I noticed there was a butcher knife in his hand. Using my back, I pushed my chair onto the floor, and the butcher knife swung to the table, missing me and Greg. I now was laying on the floor on my back. Lenora came to me and tried to hold me down as Leonard once again swung again with the butcher knife. Quickly, I headbutted Lenora, who then fell back into Leonard, and the butcher knife hit Lenora in the back. Lenora screamed as the knife cut clean through her, and the corpse fell to the ground. Leonard screamed in anger at me and came for me again, but he had forgotten Greg was there. Greg's feet was in the way, and Leonard tripped over them and fell to the ground. I crawled over to Greg, and we both started to crawl up to the door. Both of us were still unable to move our feet properly because of whatever had been in the food. Leonard got back up bleeding from a wound that the knife had caused. You monsters, you killed my sweet Lenora. I'm gonna gut you both like a fish. We both continued to try to crawl to the door, but as we got to the door, there was Edgar. I looked up at Edgar, and Edgar looked over at Leonard. And when Leonard said, "Well, boy, don't be a dumb mute, stop them," Edgar looked back down at me and Greg, and then he ran full force at Leonard. Leonard slammed the butcher knife into his heart, and Edgar fell to the ground dead. Greg and I were finally able to move as we stood up and limped out the door right before we shut it right in Leonard's face. Greg held the door shut and said, "Look for something to block the door." I looked around and found an old log, and we used that to block the door. From the other side, we could hear Leonard yelling and pounding on the door. From inside, we heard Leonard yell, "I'm gonna make you and your friend pay for what you did." Greg was looking around, and then we found an old gas can. I asked, "What are you gonna do with that?" And Greg answered, "I'm gonna burn that bastard and those fucking Leatherface wannabes inside." Greg started pouring the gas all over the place as the pounding of the door stopped. I wondered if Leonard had finally given up or was dead. Greg limped over to the car where he had his lighter and threw the lighter towards the building. I ran over to him quickly as the place caught on fire. We thought that was the end of it until the glass of one of the windows came crashing through. It was Leonard on fire coming at us. He screamed, "I'm gonna get you in that little bitch. You'll both pay." That's when Greg saw a metal pole on the ground. He picked it up and swung at Leonard's head as hard as he could, knocking Leonard to the ground. Greg kept swinging and swinging as blood splattered over Greg and I both. After a few minutes, I told Greg, "Stop! He's dead! The bastard's dead!" We got into the car as fast as we could and drove off. We sure it was behind us, and we would never see him again. I looked back, and there a burnt corpse of a man was in the back of the truck bed. "Oh my God, Greg! He's in the goddamn truck!" I yelled. Greg slammed on the brakes, and the body went flying out of the truck bed. Then Greg slammed on the gas, and we watched as the burnt corpse stood there, cursing at us. Looking back now after all these years at the moment, I wonder if he's still alive. A few years later in the 80s and early 90s, Route 66 was shut down. I wonder if the diner still stands there. There's no way to get to that diner anymore, and I guess thank God no one will ever see that place. Though the image of a burnt Leonard standing on the road as we drove away still lingers in my mind and still haunts me to this very day.